We've got a comprehensive plan of Homes for Australia, whether it is social housing, private rentals through our Build to Rent scheme, whether it's our Help to Buy scheme, or this latest announcement will help as well.
Is a single person living in one of these houses from this program?
We've built a couple of thousand.
Has a single person actually moved into one of these houses?
We've built a couple of thousand houses. There's 28,000 more in the pipeline right now, and there'll be fewer under your proposal because you want to cut the Housing Australia Future Fund.
So
that would mean fewer homes.
Not a single person is living in one of these houses.
Australia's housing crisis has been firing up the campaign trail ahead of Saturday's federal election. But in the real world, is any party actually capable of offering a solution to a crisis that is increasingly looking unsolvable? Hello, I'm Chris Bourke and welcome to the last of our Bloomberg Australia podcast election specials. With just a few days to go before Australians head to the polls and munch on their democracy sausages, we are returning to our favourite barbecue stopper, you guessed it, housing. Today we'll look at what the major parties are pledging on housing policy and, more importantly, if any of it will actually work. To do that, I'm joined by Brendan Coates, who is the Housing and Economic Security Program Director at the Grattan Institute here in Melbourne. Brendan formerly worked as an economist at the World Bank. He's also worked at the Australian Treasury, and we are lucky to have him with us today. Brendan, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. It's good to be with you.
So, Brendan, before we take a look at what the main parties are saying on housing, I think it's worth reminding our listeners just how we got here. What's your take? Why is Australia in a housing crisis, and who or what is to blame?
Thanks, Chris. Look, this is a crisis that's been building for a long time. So housing has become more expensive over recent decades. And then it got a lot worse during the pandemic. So that longer term story is one where house prices have risen from 3 to 4 times average incomes at the turn of the century to 7 to 8 times average incomes across most cities and 10 times average incomes in Sydney. That's the cost of the average home vis-a-vis the average income for someone in Sydney. The underlying cause of this is that we haven't built enough housing to meet the needs of a growing population. So Australia is one of only 4 OECD countries where the number of homes built per person, or the number of homes per person, has gone backwards over the last 2 decades. And we actually don't have that much housing, despite the fact that we're an enormous landmass, because most people live in our 5 major cities. And then since the pandemic, house prices, but also particularly rents, have gone through the roof. So both house prices and rents are up, 50% plus across Brisbane, Adelaide and Perth. Increases in Melbourne and Sydney have been a bit lower for both house prices and rents, but they've still grown pretty strongly. And that has meant that we've gone from a world where people were worried about, can I afford to buy a home, to increasingly people are worried, can I afford to keep a roof over my head?
Yeah, and it's just so complex and never ending, because house prices climbed to a fresh high in March. We seem to be having that kind of headline so regularly now, which I guess was helped obviously by the RBA's first rate cut in quite a few years. We know that there are more rate cuts on the way too. So we are desperately looking for solutions, and I wonder if either of the main parties have this. Let's start with the 2 main parties. How is Prime Minister Anthony Albanese trying to tempt voters on housing policy, and how does that compare with what Peter Dutton and the coalition are offering up?
So both the government and the opposition at their campaign launches made housing the centrepiece of those launches. And the pitch is really about trying to help first home buyers to be able to buy their first home. Labor's main policy has been extending what's called the First Home Guarantee Scheme, which basically allows people to buy a home with only a 5% deposit, with the federal government guaranteeing 15% of the loan amount so that the bank can just treat them as a normal borrower who's got a 20% deposit. There have been caps in place on that scheme that have now been removed. So there's now going to be no income caps if Labor is re-elected for that scheme, which basically means everyone will be able to buy with 5% deposit, subject to a house price cap of $1.5 million in Sydney and slightly lower caps in the other major capitals and regions. By contrast, the coalition is pitching for making mortgage repayments tax deductible for first home buyers for the first 5 years, provided that you buy a new home. That would allow people to basically deduct the interest payments for the first $650,000 of their mortgage against their taxable income, reducing their tax bills. Both these policies, though, are really about putting more money in first-home buyers' pockets, and they back up previous policies from both sides. Super for Housing from the Coalition, allowing people to borrow to take out $50,000 from their super to put it towards a house deposit. And Labor has a shared equity scheme where they would pay or co-purchase a home 30% of the purchase price for an existing home, 40% of a new home, to help get first-home buyers on lower incomes into the market. These are all pitches aimed at trying to put more money in the pockets of first-home buyers to ultimately raise the rate of home ownership.
A lot of economists don't love these policies from what I've been hearing and reading. What do you reckon? Will any of these policies work?
I think they all will raise house prices, which is obviously counterproductive.
Yep.
The coalition policies will probably raise house prices by more, particularly because they're also going to relax the serviceability buffer. So the amount that the level of interest repayments or mortgage repayments at which you are assessed on your ability to repay the loan. So the banks will be able to lend you more money in that world where that serviceability buffer is relaxed. Both policies will probably boost home ownership a little because those policies tend to do that. But Labor's policy is more targeted at those that are otherwise unlikely to buy their own home. And both policies aren't really doing much on the supply side to really get more housing built. But there are other things both the Coalition and Labor have announced in this election campaign that are focused upon that.
Yeah, let's talk about supply because, as you say, these policies are very much seen to address the demand side. I mean, how would these policies help supply? And is there anything else actually going on that behind the scenes, perhaps that is helping with supply?
So the Coalition is saying that they're making mortgage repayments tax deductible for first-home buyers would boost supply because it's only available if you are buying a new home.
Right.
At the margins, that is probably true, although I'd be careful about estimating just how much that effect would be. But in the background, this is also an election, despite these policies being focused on first-home buyers, pushing up demand, drawing the ire of most economists. There are other things going on in the background that would boost housing supply. So Labor had put forward a plan to invest $10 billion working with state government developers to get 100,000 homes built over the next 8 years, basically partnering with those developers who have the advantage, unlike private developers, of not having to pre-sell the apartments they're going to build before they can strike ground on the construction. The Coalition has a plan to put $5 billion on the table for local councils to help pay for that last mile infrastructure, roads, sewerage, water, telecommunications that are often, at least anecdotally, appear to be a constraint on new housing supply because local councils who actually are responsible for delivering that infrastructure, particularly in growth areas, don't have a tax base for existing residents to pay for that infrastructure, and this money would help them to do that. And then sitting behind all of this, Labor has, over the term of this parliament, put together a plan for 1.2 million homes agreed by National Cabinet, so the Commonwealth and all the state governments. And they're putting $3.5 billion of incentive payments on the table to basically push the states, $15,000 per home that they build, above a baseline, to basically encourage them to pull the levers that ultimately the states have, which is where the big issues are to get more housing built in Australia.
So that's interesting. I mean, as you say, the federal election is featuring this big kind of debate about housing, but actually a lot of this work is going on amongst the states themselves.
That's right. So the federal government feels accountable and is held accountable for housing affordability, but it's actually the states in Australia's constitution that hold the main levers. The two big ones are the land use planning rules, so which determine what can be built where. So, can you build an abattoir next to a school? Can you build an 8-storey apartment building, next to a school as well? And the second one is construction regulations that determine the cost of construction building regulations. Now, the states are the main they hold the can on both of these policy levers. And so it's what the states do that actually matters most. What all the feds are really doing is using the power that they have, which is the federal government checkbook, to reach across that Commonwealth state divide and try to influence what the states do. And in fact, the biggest story, hidden story of this election campaign is that the states are actually moving on this. So both Victoria and New South Wales, obviously our two biggest states, have recently reformed land use planning rules to allow a lot more housing to be built, particularly in Victoria, upzoning around, say, 60 activity centres and transport corridors in Victoria, in Melbourne, and just under 50 similar areas in Sydney. And then they're also doing a series of policies that basically make it easy to build townhouses right across the inner and middle ring suburbs of our major cities. And this has the potential to really unlock a lot of additional supply, hundreds of thousands of extra homes. And we see this, for example, in what happened in Auckland, where Auckland in 2016 upzoned 3/4 of its land area. 5 years later, they've built the equivalent of 4% of extra of the housing stock. Rents are down 20% compared to where they otherwise would be, and housing has become substantially more affordable. What we're seeing in Victoria and New South Wales, if the state governments can hold the line against community opposition from some sections of the community, the reforms are actually quite popular overall, then we could actually be on our way to solving Australia's housing crisis for the first time in, frankly, decades.
Wow. That's more positive than I've been hearing lately. The zoning stuff is interesting because no matter what we might think, we think we live in these very crowded cities, but Sydney and Melbourne, from what I understand, are substantially less dense than some of the major capitals of the world.
Yeah, Australian cities, Melbourne and Sydney, populations above 5 million are some of the least dense cities of their size in the world. And it really comes down to the fact that if, say, in Melbourne, the land within 10 kilometres of the city centre, basically half of it is zoned for neighbourhood residential, the most restrictive zone. In Sydney, the most restrictive zone in R2, and you look at a map of Sydney and you see that plus heritage restrictions account for a lot of the land that could otherwise be built upon. And the result is that people are pushed further out. They're pushed out into greenfield areas, or they have to stay living with their parents or in share houses because the housing that they would like to have hasn't been built. And what we see in our research, Chris, is if you ask people, are you willing to trade off, willing to live in an apartment or a townhouse for a reasonable price if it puts you closer to the city centre, a lot of residents of Melbourne and Sydney say yes. Whereas that housing doesn't get built at the scale that it needs to be built right now. And so ultimately, housing's less affordable and our economy actually functions more poorly because people are further from the jobs that otherwise could exist in the city.
Okay. When we come back, everyone's talking about first home buyers, but what about the renters? Welcome back to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. You're here with me, Chris Bourke, and I'm talking to Brendan Coates, one of the Grattan Institute's resident experts on all things housing. Brendan, we've spoken about what the two main parties are pledging on housing and how both of their policies are maybe only going to touch the sides when it comes to the housing supply and demand problem. But look, we do have to talk about the Greens as well. They've been among the most vocal about housing issues over the past couple of years and have really been a thorn in Albanese's side at times. What's their big idea to persuade voters on Saturday?
So the Greens have been incredibly vocal in this term of Parliament and have picked up housing as one of their big issues that they're wanting to run on. And so the big policies they put forward are to reform housing tax breaks that go to investors, so lowering the capital gains tax discount, currently 50%, that reduces the amount of tax that investors pay on not just property but all investments if they hold them for more than 12 months, and scrapping negative gearing, which is basically the ability to offset the losses from an investment property, say the interest costs, the maintenance, the council rates, against your wage and salary income, so basically reducing your tax bills. They also have a big plan to basically have a public developer build something like 600,000 homes over the next decade and make them available in part to first home buyers. It's modelled on the Singapore's Housing Development Board program, where the Singaporean government builds a lot of housing that makes it available to first home buyers. And they're also pushing for a national rent freeze for 2 years, so basically capping rents for 2 years. And then after that, having a national renters protection authority, which would have the power to basically investigate breaches of tenancy law, noting, of course, that these are issues that really sit with the states. It's the states that are responsible for rental tenancy law. And so those powers would have to be deferred to the Commonwealth if it was to regulate this.
Yeah, they seem to be targeting both first home buyers and renters with those policies. But, approximately a third of Australians are renters, right? The main parties don't seem to be offering a huge amount for them, but of course I may be missing a trick there. What are they offering if you're one of these renters?
So there aren't big offerings from either major party. Particularly, there's very little from the Coalition. The Coalition seems to have decided that first home buyers are its target market, and it's not offering a great deal for renters. Labor has put in place a tax breaks for build-to-rent developments over the course of this term of Parliament. that would basically involve build-to-rent developers, which is institutions rather than sort of mum and dad investors that account for most of the residential housing stock, are basically trying to get more of those build-to-rent developments up and running that would offer more secure tenancies, longer-term leases to renters. Labor has raised the rate of Commonwealth rent assistance, which is the payment that goes to low-income renters who receive another income support payment, by 27% in real terms over the course of the last couple of budgets. So Labor has done quite a bit for renters. The challenge is that those reforms or those policy levers that matter for renters, particularly tenancy laws, they are really state issues. So there's limits on what the federal government can in fact do to shift the dial on renters' rights in Australia.
So you guys at Grattan spend hours poring over research, writing research and talking to governments, forming policy recommendations, etc. What do you think the answer is to the housing crisis in 60 seconds or less?
I think the short answer is, Chris, is building more homes. So it's pushing the states to get more housing built because that's ultimately what will make housing more affordable. Housing's expensive because it's scarce. It will be cheaper if it's abundant. Beyond that, it's then helping support vulnerable renters who would otherwise struggle to pay to keep a roof over their head. That involves raising rent assistance by another 40% for couples and 50% for singles, and adding to the Housing Australia Future Fund, which is a Labor government policy that's about building 30,000 social affordable homes. We would like to see that tripled from $10 to $30 billion. And those policies together, more homes and more support for vulnerable renters, is our best shot at solving the housing crisis in Australia.
Easy. Look, as I alluded to before, we have more rate cuts probably coming down the line, which will likely stimulate a demand for housing, which means prices may continue going up. Who knows? What's at stake here? Let's look at the bigger picture. What happens to prices and even society as a whole if we don't do anything substantial to help give everyone a fair chance to own their own home?
Chris, I think there's just an enormous amount at stake here, and I think that's why housing has become probably number one, if not number one or two, issue of the election campaign, because so many things are downstream of housing. If you can't find secure and affordable housing, then it's harder to start your careers. You're less likely to create a business and be an entrepreneur, and we do worry that the high rates of mortgage debt amongst younger Australians are having that effect. If we don't allow more people to live closer to where they want to, which is close to the centres of our major cities, our cities are giant labour markets. If we impede where people can live, you basically make matching in the labour market worse, means you get lower rates of productivity growth, you get less investment, and Australians end up being poorer. And then we should worry about this because it is contributing to rising inequality. Wealth inequality in Australia has gotten a bit worse in the last decade, but it's largely because of housing, because of the growing gap between the housing haves and the have-nots. At the moment, that's partly an intergenerational story. So older generations own a lot of housing, younger generations struggling to get in. But over the course of the next 3 decades, those houses are going to be inherited from the boomers by younger generations, and it will become a big intra-generational inequality problem. Your endeavours in life will depend much more on who your parents are rather than what you do with your own life, and that's not a society that we want to see.
Wow, no, most certainly not. So, a lot of work to do. I guess voters can take some heart from, while they may not be seeing a huge amount to excite them at the federal election, that there is certainly stuff going on behind the scenes in the States. Something positive to take away. Thanks, Brendan, and thank you for listening to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. I'm Chris Bourke. This episode was recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Ainsley Chandler, Rebecca Jones, and Ainsley Thompson. Don't forget to follow and review the show wherever you get your podcasts, and sign up to Bloomberg's free daily newsletter, Australia Briefing. Go to bloomberg.com to subscribe.